What if I told you that fairies aren't the cute, winged creatures from children's books? What if they're actually fallen gods, ancient, powerful beings who remember ruling this world before humans? And what if they're still here, watching from just beyond our reality, waiting in the hollow hills? Today, we're tearing down everything you think you know about fairies and uncovering their true identity, the dispossessed nobility of a magical age, a conquered pantheon that never truly disappeared. There are places where the world we know grows thin, not locations you'll find on any map, but territories you feel in your bones. An ancient forest where trees stand too close, blocking out the sun and leaving the ground in perpetual twilight. A mist-shrouded hillside where stones older than memory rise from the earth like the bones of forgotten giants. The edge of a lonely moor at dusk where fading light plays tricks on your eyes and the wind through the heather whispers names you almost recognize. In these places, the air grows heavy with presence. The silence isn't empty, it's watchful. You've crossed an invisible threshold, leaving the safety of the human world and entering the territory of something else, a parallel kingdom hidden in plain sight. For millennia, those who lived near these borderlands understood they weren't alone. They shared the land with an unseen nation, beings of terrifying intelligence who weren't human, but weren't entirely other either. Survival meant learning their laws and respecting their boundaries. You never spoke their true name out loud. That would attract their attention. Instead, you used careful titles, both description and plea. The good neighbors, the people of peace, the gentry. In Scotland, simply the wee folk. These weren't terms of endearment. They were diplomatic titles, desperate attempts to appease an ancient power that was unpredictable and utterly indifferent to human morality. To name them was to summon them. To summon them was to gamble with your soul. These names passed down in hushed tones through generations formed a fragile shield against a power that was neither good nor evil, but primordial, intelligent, and profoundly alien. The power of the Fae, the fair folk, the beings we've come to call fairies. The word itself now conjures images of gentle sprites with gossamer wings, benevolent garden guardians who dance on dewdrops and grant wishes with glittering dust. But this is a modern taming, a profound and dangerous misunderstanding. The stories our ancestors told weren't whimsical children's tales. They were warnings, field guides to survival in a world saturated with magic that could bless or blight with equal ease. So who are these beings truly? Are they memories of fallen gods? Vengeful spirits of the land itself? Or something else entirely? A civilization watching humanity from the shadows, operating by rules so ancient that to break them, even accidentally, invites absolute ruin. To find the answer, we must part the veil and step into their world. Before the written word, there was memory. Before history, there was myth. To find the first and most powerful identity of the fair folk, we travel to Ireland, where the mythology of a conquered pantheon still echoes across the landscape. The story here isn't about nature spirits born of earth. It's a history of war, dynastic struggle, and a race of gods who lost their world. They were called the Tuatha de Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. According to ancient chronicles, they were godlike beings, masters of art, science, magic, and war. They didn't rise from Irish soil, they descended upon it. Legends say they came from 4 great cities in the north, arriving in a fleet of ships. Upon landing, they burned their vessels, a final commitment to their new home.
They shrouded their arrival in impenetrable mist lasting 3 days and nights, an act of such powerful magic that the island's inhabitants believed the sky itself had fallen. With them came 4 great treasures of immense power. From Fairies, the stone of destiny, the Lia Fáil, which would cry out when the true High King of Ireland stood upon it. From Gorius, the invincible sword of light wielded by King Nuada, from which no enemy could escape once drawn. From Phineas, the spear of Lug, which thirsted so deeply for blood its point had to be kept submerged in a cauldron of sleeping draught to quell its fury. From Murius, the cauldron of the Dagda, a vessel of plenty from which no company would ever leave hungry. These weren't trinkets of forest sprites, they were the implements of gods. With them, the Tuatha de Danann claimed Ireland as their own. Their dominion wasn't won easily. They first clashed with the Fir Bolg, the ruling people, in the first battle of Mag Tuired. The Tuatha Dé's magic and martial skill proved superior, and they triumphed. But victory came at a cost. King Nuada lost his arm in battle, a mutilation that by their laws made him unfit to rule. This single act of violence set in motion a chain of events leading to far greater conflict. They were soon challenged by the Fomorians, a race of grotesque, semi-divine beings representing nature's chaotic, destructive power. The second battle of Mag Tuired was cataclysmic. Led by the brilliant young champion Lug of the Long Arm, the Tuatha de Danann emerged victorious, driving the Fomorians back into the sea and securing their golden age. For generations, they ruled Ireland as gods on earth. Their palaces were centers of music, poetry, and magic. But their age was destined to end. A new people arrived on Ireland's shores, the Milesians. Ancestors of the modern Irish, these were mortal men, but they possessed a new kind of power, a destiny the ancient magic of the Tuatha de Danann couldn't overcome. A final war was fought, and this time the gods lost. The world of myth was giving way to the world of men, but the Tuatha Dé were immortal. Their defeat wasn't an ending, it was a transformation. In a great council, they agreed to a treaty with the victorious mortals. They would cede the surface world, the visible island, to humanity. In return, they would take the other island, the world existing just beneath the surface, within ancient burial mounds and great hollow hills known as the sídhe. This was their great retreat. They didn't vanish, they merely stepped sideways into a parallel dimension, a hidden kingdom mirroring our own. They became the Osí, the people of the mounds. Their godly palaces were replaced by ethereal halls beneath the green earth, their gateways hidden in ancient cairns and stone rings still dotting the Irish countryside. Here, in this act of magical secession, the first great identity of the Fairfolk is forged. The Osí of Ireland aren't cute winged creatures. They're a fallen pantheon, powerful, intelligent, often proud beings who remember when they ruled the world. They're the dispossessed nobility of a magical age, living in exile just beyond the veil of our senses. When they interact with the mortal world, it's with the complex emotions of a conquered people, sometimes with kindness, sometimes with bitter resentment, but always with the memory of lost divinity. They aren't gone. They're simply hidden, watching from the hollow hills.
The hidden kingdom of the Fae is not a monolith. To imagine them as a single unified people is a fatal error. Within the Otherworld exists a great and ancient schism, a division as fundamental as day and night, summer and winter. Two rival monarchies govern this realm, their philosophies defining the very nature of fairy existence. In Scottish lore, they're known as the sídhe and unsídhe courts. First, we turn to the light. The sídhe court, often called the Blessed Court, represents the aristocracy of the fairy world. They embody nature in its glory. Long golden summer afternoons, life-giving rain, the breathtaking beauty of wild landscapes. They're described as tall, noble, breathtakingly beautiful, possessed of grace that can captivate mortal hearts. They're fond of hunting, feasting, and riding in great processions through twilight hours. But don't mistake their beauty for simple goodness. Their benevolence is conditional. Their kindness is a matter of protocol and honor. The sídhe aren't good in the human sense. They're proud, powerful nobility who can be generous to those showing proper respect and merciless to those who don't. Their kindness isn't the selfless compassion of a saint. It's the conditional favor of a monarch, withdrawable in an instant. To slight them, break a promise, or even thank them too profusely, implying they're mere servants, invites swift and terrible retribution. The nature of their conditional aid is best understood through one widespread tale, the fairy midwife. The story begins on a dark, stormy night. A mortal midwife is summoned by a mysterious, well-dressed stranger to attend his wife's labor. She's led on a strange journey, often through misty woods or into the side of a hill, until she arrives at a brilliantly lit hall filled with noble, beautiful people. She realizes she's been brought into a fairy mound. Putting fear aside, she performs her duties with skill and compassion, successfully delivering a healthy fairy child. As a reward, the father presents her with gold and a small pot of ointment, instructing her to anoint the baby's eyes. But as she does, a single drop accidentally touches one of her own eyes. The world changes. With her anointed eye, she can now see the fairies in their true, dazzling forms. With her other eye, she sees only the mundane world. She's been given the second sight. In the more common telling, her story ends tragically. Days later, at a mortal market, she sees the same fairy nobleman stealing goods from a vendor's stall. Forgetting herself, she approaches and asks after his wife and child. The fairy is stunned. "Which eye do you see me with?" he demands. When she points to the enchanted eye, he strikes it with his finger. Her sight of his world is instantly and permanently extinguished, blind to the fairy realm forever. A stark punishment for the simple crime of acknowledging their presence in our world. The sídhe court may be blessed, but their blessings come with a heavy price. They operate by a code of honor alien to our own. Breaking their rules, even unknowingly, risks losing everything. Their light is bright, but it casts long, dangerous shadows. And it's to those shadows we now turn. For every sunlit glade, there's a lightless chasm. For every noble sídhe rider, there's a monstrous hunter of the dark. We now enter the domain of the unsídhe court. The name itself is a warning, derived from the old Scots word for unholy. These are the fairies of our deepest fears, the shadow self of the fairy race. They embody nature not in its beauty, but in its brutal, unforgiving reality. The howling winter storm, the sickened livestock, the predator stalking the night. They, unlike the sídhe who may be reasoned with, the unsídhe are driven by a pure desire to cause harm and suffering to humankind. They're the source of blighted crops, sickened livestock, and that sudden chilling feeling of being watched in the dark. Their ranks include the most terrifying figures in folklore. The redcaps, grotesque goblin-like creatures haunting ruined castles along the Scottish border. They're named for the woolen caps they wear, which must stay soaked in fresh victims' blood, for if the blood dries, they perish. The slug, the host of the unforgiven dead, the most dreaded of all fairies. Spirits of the most sinful mortals denied entry to both heaven and hell. They fly through the night sky in great flocks, appearing like dark clouds or bird swarms, hunting for souls of the dying to snatch away before they reach the afterlife. But the ultimate expression of unseelie terror is their great and terrible procession, the wild hunt. On stormy nights, particularly during seasonal turnings, a spectral hunt tears across the sky. Ghostly red-eyed hounds run at the heels of shrieking supernatural horses, ridden by an unseelie host led by a fearsome lord or lady. To witness the wild hunt is a terrible omen, a sign of impending war or plague. To be caught in its path is far worse. The unfortunate mortal soul is ripped from their body to join the ghastly procession for all eternity, forever hunting and forever hunted. The unseelie court is the counterbalance to the seelie, darkness to their light, chaos to their order. They're a reminder that the world of the Fae isn't a place of simple wonder. It's a realm of profound, primal forces, some that create and others that exist only to destroy. To interact with the Fae is to step onto a battlefield of ancient laws and forgotten protocols. The Otherworld isn't lawless. It's governed by rules far older and more absolute than any mortal decree. These aren't laws of morality, of good and evil as we understand them. They're the fundamental physics of a magical reality. To break them isn't a sin, it's a catastrophe. For generations, this knowledge was passed down as stark, simple warnings, a litany of thou shalt nots, forming a fragile wall between the human world and the terrible power of the Fae. The first law concerns a simple metal, iron. To the fair folk, cold iron is anathema. It burns their Etherean's flesh, negates their magic, and drives them away in terror. A simple iron nail, a horseshoe hung over a door, or even scissors kept in a cradle were believed to be powerful wards. But why? The reason is deeply symbolic. Iron is the metal of human industry, dug from the earth, smelted in fire, beaten into submission by mortal hands. It represents humanity's dominion over the natural world. The Fae, as beings of pure, untamed nature, are repulsed by this symbol of human conquest. Iron is the mundane world made manifest, and its very presence disrupts the fragile magic upon which their existence depends. Again, should you ever find yourself within their realm, whether in a sunlit seelie hall or a shadowed unseelie grove, you must never eat or drink what's offered. The food of the Otherworld, though it may appear as the most delicious fruit or tempting wine, is an enchantment. To consume even a single crumb or drop is to bind your soul to their land forever. You become part of their world, a permanent resident of their kingdom. The path back to your own life is sealed. Mythologies worldwide are filled with tragic figures, from the Greek goddess Persephone trapped in the underworld for eating pomegranate seeds, to countless mortals in fairy tales who, through a moment of hunger or weakness, doomed themselves to eternal exile. The other forbidden deed is giving out your real name. In the old world, a name wasn't merely a label. It was a distillation of one's true essence, a piece of one's soul given sound. To give your name to one of the Fae is to give them a hook into that soul, granting them direct and terrible power over you. They can summon you at will, bind you to their service, or curse you with a word. This is why in so many tales, fairies are obsessed with learning mortals' names, and why heroes like the Miller's Daughter and Rumpelstiltskin must risk everything to discover the fairy's own true name, turning their power back upon them. Perhaps the most terrifying and insidious law is one over which mortals have no control, the treacherous nature of time. The Otherworld doesn't operate on the same temporal plane as our own. Time there is fluid, unpredictable, a great river that can slow to near standstill or rush forward in devastating torrent.
What feels like a single night of dancing in a fairy hill can be a century in the mortal world. To step into their realm is to become unmoored from your own life, to risk returning to a world where everyone you've known is gone, your home is ruins, and your life is a forgotten memory. This temporal distortion is perfectly illustrated in the legend of Thomas the Rhymer. Thomas was a real 13th century Scottish laird and poet, said to possess the gift of prophecy. One day, while resting beneath an Ilden tree, a known gateway to the Otherworld, Thomas saw a magnificent lady on a white horse. It was the Queen of Elfland herself. Utterly captivated by her beauty, he pledged himself to her service. She led him into the hollow hills to her kingdom, a land of wonders beyond mortal imagination. There he feasted and celebrated with her court. He believed he'd stayed 3 days, but the queen, who'd grown fond of him, knew the truth. She warned him that a tithe to hell was due, and she feared the devil would choose him, her handsome mortal pet. To save him, she granted him a gift and a command, a tongue that could not lie, the source of his prophetic power, and sent him back to his own world. When Thomas emerged from the hill, he discovered he hadn't been gone 3 days. He'd been gone 7 years. His return with the gift of prophecy was actually a curse. He could see the future, but his time in the Otherworld had forever marked him, setting him apart from his own kind. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, no longer fully mortal, but never truly fey. His story is the ultimate cautionary tale. Even the most wondrous gifts from the fair folk come at a price. And the greatest price of all is the loss of your own time, your own life, in the treacherous, ageless lands of the Fae. The power of the fair folk isn't confined to wild, forgotten places. Their influence can reach across the threshold of a home, past the hearth, into the most sacred and vulnerable of spaces, the cradle. For all the tales of fairy bargains and otherworldly journeys, no aspect of their lore has inspired more intimate, primal terror than the myth of the changeling. This isn't a story of a hero's quest, it's a parent's worst nightmare. The quiet, creeping horror of looking at your own child and realizing the person staring back isn't your child at all. The legend is brutally simple. In the dead of night or during liminal twilight hours, fairies would steal a healthy human infant from its crib. In its place, they'd leave one of their own, a sickly, ill-tempered fairy creature, or sometimes an ancient, wizened fairy disguised as a baby. This creature, the changeling, would then be raised by unsuspecting human parents. The reasons for this abduction vary. Some tales suggest fairies coveted human children for their beauty, or to strengthen their own dying race with mortal blood. Others claim they needed mortal infants to pay their tithe to hell, sacrificing a human child in place of one of their own. But to parents left with the otherworldly impostor, the motive was irrelevant. All they knew was that the child they loved had been replaced by a thing of profound wrongness. The symptoms of a changeling were a checklist of parental anxieties: perpetually sick and frail, refusing to grow, possessed of an insatiable appetite, draining the family's resources without ever seeming nourished. Its cry wasn't a human baby's cry, but a piercing, unearthly shriek. Most unnervingly, its eyes held a cold, ancient intelligence, a look of cunning and malice, terrifying in an infant's face. These folkloric descriptions are a dark mirror, reflecting the grim realities of a pre-modern world. In an age with no understanding of congenital disorders, developmental disabilities, or infant diseases, the changeling myth provided a supernatural explanation for a child who was different. A baby who failed to thrive, suffered from undiagnosed illness, or was born with physical deformity could be tragically recategorized not as a sick child needing care, but as a monstrous intruder. The myth became a framework for explaining the unexplainable, a way to give face to nature's random cruelties. This disbelief, born of fear and grief, led to grim and desperate rituals designed to expose the changeling and force the fairies to return the true child. These weren't gentle acts of persuasion. They were trials by ordeal. A suspected changeling might be left on a cold hearth, held over fire, or dunked in a running stream, the belief being that the creature, in its terror, would reveal its true form and flee. These practices, shocking to modern sensibilities, were born from absolute conviction that the being in the cradle wasn't a suffering child, but a monstrous intruder. The devastating real-world consequences of this belief aren't confined to the distant past. They culminated in a horrific, well-documented tragedy in late 19th century Ireland, a case known as the Last Witch Burning in Ireland. This is the story of Bridget Cleary. In 1895, Bridget, a young, independent, respected woman from County Tipperary, fell ill with what was likely pneumonia or bronchitis. As her condition worsened and her behavior became erratic, her husband Michael and her extended family became consumed by terrible suspicion. This wasn't Bridget. The real Bridget had been taken by fairies who lived in a nearby fort. This creature in her bed was a changeling left in her place. What followed was a week of escalating horror. Michael and Bridget's relatives subjected her to brutal folk rituals designed to exorcise the fairy imposter. They forced her to drink herbal concoctions, threw urine on her, and repeatedly held her over fire, demanding she reveal her true name and return the real Bridget. Her terrified pleas that she was his wife were dismissed as the cunning lies of the changeling. The ordeal reached its ghastly conclusion on the night of March 15th. In a final desperate act of madness, Michael Cleary, convinced the fairy would flee its vessel if confronted with fire, doused his wife in lamp oil and set her ablaze. Bridget Cleary was burned to death in her own home, surrounded by the family that believed they weren't killing a woman, but destroying a monster. The subsequent trial shocked the world. It was a brutal collision between age-old beliefs of rural Ireland and the modern legal system of the British Empire. Michael Cleary was convicted not of witchcraft, but of manslaughter. His sentence reduced because the court acknowledged he'd acted out of genuine, if terribly misguided, belief. The case of Bridget Cleary is a haunting testament to the power of folklore, a grim reminder that these aren't just stories. For centuries, the fear of the changeling was a real and present danger, a belief that could turn a family's love into a fatal weapon and transform the sacred space of the cradle into a grave.
As the shadows of the 17th century began to lengthen, a new kind of light was dawning in Europe, the cold, hard light of the Age of Reason. Science, logic, and empirical evidence were beginning to dismantle the old world of superstition and magic. Belief in a literal, physical otherworld was in retreat, its borders shrinking under the relentless advance of the modern mind. But on the fringes of this new world, in the misty highlands of Scotland, there were still those who walked the borderlands. One man, caught between the encroaching light of reason and the deep twilight mysteries of the old world, would make one final fateful attempt to map the unseen kingdom. His name was Robert Kirk. By all appearances, he was a respectable figure, an ordained minister in the Church of Scotland, a scholar of theology, a man of letters. But Kirk was a man of two worlds. He was the seventh son in his family, a detail that in the folklore of his time marked him as one born with the second sight, the innate ability to see the world of spirits. He was a man of God who spent his days preaching the Christian gospel, but spent his nights as an ethnographer of the Fae. Kirk didn't see the fair folk as mere superstition or peasant tales. He believed them to be a real, tangible parallel society. He dedicated himself to studying them with the meticulous care of a naturalist. He interviewed countless people who claimed encounters with them, collecting stories and cross-referencing accounts. The result was a remarkable and dangerous manuscript completed around 1691, titled The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies. This wasn't a book of fairy tales, it was a scientific treatise, a detailed field report on the society, biology, and politics of the Otherworld. Kirk described the fairies as being of a middle nature betwixt man and angel, their bodies made not of flesh and blood, but of congealed air. He detailed their social structures, their clothing, their invisible castles, even their methods of abducting human children. He wasn't a storyteller. He was a cartographer, drawing a map of a world he believed as real as his own. But to draw a map of a secret kingdom is to betray its secrets. And the fair folk, as we know, are jealous guardians of their world. To reveal their ways, to write their laws in black ink for any mortal to read, was an act of profound transgression. Kirk knew he was walking a perilous path, but his scholarly curiosity outweighed his caution. In May of 1692, shortly after completing his manuscript, Robert Kirk took his customary evening walk. His path led him, as it often did, to the Dune Hill, the fairy hill overlooking the village of Aberfoyle. It was a place long believed to be a gateway to the Otherworld, a place Kirk had studied with intense fascination. He never returned. His body was found lying on the hill later that evening. The official cause of death was recorded as apoplexy, a sudden collapse. A perfectly rational, scientific explanation. But the people of Aberfoyle, who'd lived their whole lives in the shadow of that hill, knew better. They didn't believe Robert Kirk was dead. They believed he'd been taken. They whispered that the fairies, in their fury, had punished him for his trespass. They'd stolen his soul, leaving his body behind as an empty shell, and made him a prisoner in their realm, their eternal chaplain, forced to minister to the very beings he'd exposed. The legend grew. It was said that Kirk's spirit appeared to one of his relatives shortly after his funeral, delivering a final, desperate message. He wasn't dead, he was a captive. He would make one last attempt to return to the world of men, appearing at the baptism of his own posthumous child. He begged his cousin to throw an iron knife, a dirk, over his apparition's head when he appeared. The touch of cold iron would break the fairy enchantment and free him from his prison. But when the day of the baptism came, and Kirk's spectral form appeared in the church as promised, his cousin was so overcome with terror that he failed to act. The apparition faded. Robert Kirk was never seen again. The story of Robert Kirk is the perfect epilogue to the Age of Belief. He was the last Gaoler of the Secret Commonwealth, a man who treated the fairy world not as fantasy, but as fact. And his mysterious end, whether by natural causes or supernatural retribution, became a final, chilling legend. After him, the door to that world seemed to close. The fair folk retreated from the realm of ethnography and history, vanishing back into the mists of folklore, waiting to be rediscovered, not as neighbors, but as characters in a story.
The taming of the Fae. The world that had feared the fair folk was beginning to disappear. It was being paved over by the relentless march of industry,
lit by the cold, rational glare of science and measured by the unforgiving logic of the machine. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, humanity's relationship with the natural world was undergoing profound and violent change. The deep, dark forests where the Fae held sway were being felled for timber. The lonely moors were being crossed by railways. The mysteries of the earth were being explained away by geology and biology. Nature was no longer a powerful, sentient entity to be feared and respected. It was a resource to be exploited. In this new world, there was little room for the old gods of the hollow hills. The tall, aristocratic, terrifying AOC had no place in a landscape of factories and smog. But the idea of them, the deep human need for a world touched by magic, didn't vanish. It was simply repackaged. The fairies of old were too dangerous, too alien, too morally ambiguous for the sentimental tastes of the Victorian era. And so they were demoted. They were tamed. This transformation was driven by a new kind of magic, the printing press and the rise of children's literature. The grim cautionary tales collected by folklorists were sanitized and rewritten for the nursery. The great and terrible fairy queen was replaced by the tiny, benevolent fairy godmother. The Fae were put through a cultural filter that stripped them of their ancient power and remade them in humanity's own image, only smaller, prettier, and far less threatening. Their very appearance changed. The tall, human-like beings of old were shrunk to diminutive size. They were given delicate, insect-like wings of butterflies or dragonflies, a feature almost entirely absent from ancient folklore. They were dressed in clothes made of flowers and dewdrops. Their courts were no longer held in magnificent subterranean halls, but in the cups of bluebells and atop mushrooms. The raw, untamed power of the Otherworld was distilled into safe, sweet, marketable fantasy. The terror of the Fae had become the whimsy of the flower fairy. Nowhere is this taming more complete than in J.M. Barrie's creation of Tinker Bell. She's the archetypal modern fairy, tiny, temperamental, and powered not by primordial magic, but by the belief of children. Her famous line, "Every time a child says, 'I don't believe in fairies,' there is a fairy somewhere that falls down dead," is the ultimate expression of this new, fragile state. The existence of the old Fae was a terrifying, undeniable fact of the world. The existence of the new fairy was a delicate fantasy, a thing that could be destroyed by a simple word of doubt. The monster that could steal your soul had become a creature whose soul you could save with a round of applause. This new, gentler version of the fairy was a creature born of nostalgia, a symbol of lost pastoral innocence in an increasingly mechanized world. And it was this desperate yearning for lost magic that set the stage for one of the most remarkable and bizarre episodes in the history of folklore. The Cottingley Fairies. The story begins in 1917 in the small village of Cottingley, West Yorkshire. Two young cousins, Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths, claimed to have not only seen but photographed fairies at the bottom of their garden. The images they produced were stunning. The girls interacting with small winged figures, classic Victorian-style sprites dancing in the air or sunning themselves on leaves. The photographs became a sensation. To understand why the world was so ready to believe, one must understand the time. Britain was in the depths of the First World War. The relentless mechanized slaughter of the trenches had shattered a generation and created a profound crisis of faith. At the same time, the spiritualist movement was at its peak, with millions, including some of the most educated people in the country, seeking proof of an afterlife, a sign that there was more to reality than the brutal materialism that had led to war. Into this atmosphere of grief and longing came the Cottingley photographs. They were a whisper of hope, tangible evidence that a gentler, more magical world still existed.
The case was championed by one of the most famous men of the age, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of the arch-rationalist Sherlock Holmes. Doyle, a committed spiritualist who'd lost his son in the war, saw the photographs as incontrovertible proof of a spiritual plane. He published the images in the Strand magazine, lending them his immense credibility and turning a local curiosity into a global phenomenon. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the door to the secret commonwealth had been kicked open once more. It would be decades later, in the early 1980s, that an elderly Elsie and Francis finally confessed. The fairies were a hoax, a charming and expertly executed prank using cardboard cutouts secured with hat pins. But their story isn't one of simple deception. The true power of the Codingly fairies lies not in their authenticity, but in what their acceptance revealed. They were a reflection of a world so desperate for wonder, so starved for enchantment, that it was willing to see a miracle in a child's game. It was the final poignant chapter in the taming of the Fae. Humanity no longer feared them enough to leave out offerings of iron and salt. Instead, we missed them so much that we were willing to create them ourselves, just to feel for a moment that the world was still magical after all.
And so we return to the threshold where our journey began. We've walked with the fallen gods of Ireland as they retreated into the hollow hills. We've stood in the blinding light of the Seelie court and weathered the terrifying darkness of the unseelie hunt. We've peered into the cradle of the changeling and stood witness at the grave of the man who saw too much. We've seen the fair folk tamed, shrunk, and placed in the pages of children's books. The question, then, is no longer what they are, but why they remain. After all the science and all the centuries, why does the whisper of their names still have the power to raise the hair on our arms? Perhaps it's because the story of the fair folk was never truly about them. It was always a story about us. It's a vast and complex metaphor for humanity's relationship with the one thing we've always sought to control and have never truly understood: the natural world. The Fae, in their original and most powerful form, are the soul of the wilderness made manifest. They're the personification of a world that isn't built for us, that doesn't care for our laws, and that operates by a logic both beautiful and terrifyingly brutal. The duality of the two courts is the duality of nature itself. The Seelie court is the sun that warms the fields, the gentle rain that nurtures crops, the breathtaking beauty of a wild landscape. The unseelie court is the flash flood that scours the valley, the winter blight that brings famine, the predator that stalks the edges of firelight. They're not good and evil, they're two faces of a single, primordial, amoral power. A power that gives life with one hand and takes it with the other, without malice and without mercy. The retreat of the Eos Sea into the hollow hills is the story of the wilderness itself retreating from the iron and smoke of human industry. Their kingdom is the last echo of a world that was once entirely magical, a world we've systematically paved over, fenced in, and forgotten. In this light, the old laws of the Fae become not superstitions, but profound ecological warnings. The taboo of cold iron is a warning against the arrogance of industry. The peril of a fairy bargain is a caution against the endless desire to take more from the land than it's willing to give. The treacherous nature of their time is a reminder of the deep geological time of the Earth is impossibly vast compared to our own fleeting human lives. To respect the fair folk was simply another way of saying respect the land. For the land is alive, it's intelligent, and it has a very, very long memory. The Victorian taming of the fairy was a symptom of our own changing belief. As we conquered the wilderness, we believed we'd conquered its spirits as well. We made them small, gentle, and harmless because we desperately wanted to believe that nature itself was no longer a threat. We put wings on them and placed them in our gardens because we'd convinced ourselves that the wild world was now our private park, a place for our leisure and entertainment. We stopped fearing them because we stopped fearing the dark woods. But the wilderness remembers. The old world has not vanished. It's merely sleeping. And perhaps the true horror of the fairy myth is not that they might steal a child or curse a crop. The true horror is that they might be real, and that we, in our modern arrogance, have forgotten the old laws. We've forgotten the proper offerings, the words of respect, the fear that kept us safe. We've built our bright, noisy world on the very borders of their silent, ancient kingdom. And we've forgotten that a border can be crossed from both sides.
So the next time you find yourself in one of those thin places, a quiet wood, a lonely hill, a misty shore at twilight, and you feel that old, familiar sense of being watched, pause and listen. Listen for the sound of hoofbeats in the clouds, for the whisper of a promise on the wind. The good neighbors have not gone away. They're simply waiting. Waiting for our world to grow quiet once more. Waiting for the forests to grow back. And in their timeless kingdom, they have all the time in the world. If this deep dive into the true history of the fair folk fascinated you, I'd love to have you join me for the next journey into the shadows of folklore and mythology. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss when we pull back the veil on another ancient mystery. Drop a comment below telling me, have you ever experienced one of those thin places? That moment where the modern world felt like it was just a little too far away? Thanks for walking through the mist with me today. Until next time, respect the old laws, leave your offerings, and never, ever give them your true name.